Okay, so we were talking about what Morrison calls the desperate strategy of infanticide, and I was giving that example from the Holocaust to help us sort of understand the desperation that Setha must have felt, that mothers must feel in times of great despair. Um, and that helps us kind of gain some perspective on why Setha does what she does, which is kill beloved and try to kill her other children. But she's unsuccessful. So this chapter 16 is told from the perspective of the white men who come to recapture Setha and her children. It opens with the four horsemen, which makes reference to the apocalypse, the four horsemen of the apocalypse. And the four men are schoolteacher, his nephew, the sheriff, and the slave catcher that schoolteacher hired to track Setha and her children down. And what we see come up over and over in this chapter is reference to the beating and reference to animality. Okay, so over and over we hear both schoolteacher and his nephew talk about the beating, like as the catalyst for her escape. And schoolteacher said that she had gone wild due to the nephew's overbeating. And he had left that nephew at home. He didn't get to come on the hunt. That's what schoolteacher calls it. Because he had overbeat Setha. And schoolteacher says, what if you overbeat horses or dogs? They're likely to turn on you. So the idea that she'd gone wild, like a wild animal. So we see that the union of that idea of the beating as the catalyst and they're thinking of her in sort of animal terms. And then the nephew says, what'd she go and do that for? Why would she kill her children? He had been beaten before. He'd gotten whipped. And he never would react like that. And of course, we know from the first chapter when Setha and Paldi are talking about, the tree on her back. And Paldi says, they whipped you when you were pregnant? She says, and they took my milk. He said, they used cowhide on you? And she said, and they took my milk. So for her, the beating was not insignificant. She tells us she bit off part of her tongue. But the beating was secondary to the fact that she could not protect and provide for her own children. Okay, but they see it as the beating. They see slavery, the physical brutality of slavery. And what Morrison wants us to see is the emotional and psychological brutality of slavery that would drive a woman to save her children by killing them. Because death would be preferable to what they would endure in slavery, in her mind. And so, and then we see this idea of equating them with animals. The sheriff calls them the damnedest bunch of coons he'd ever seen. And this is what happens when they're allowed to act apart from a master. And what Morrison is doing in this chapter is she's making reference to what's called the pro-slavery argument. Up until about 1800, slavery was described in America as a necessary evil. But as the abolitionist movement grew and the institution of slavery came under threat, Southerners kind of repackaged it as, meaning rhetorically, they wrote essays and sermons and treatises, and they repackaged it as what they called a positive good. But up until that time, Southerners recognized that slavery was evil. But as they began to repackage it, they began to talk about, very much in the language of this chapter, about the savagery, they would often use that word, or barbarity of the African nature. And so what they were arguing was that this was innate, inherent, a part of the nature of the slave. Not that it was something created by slavery. right? One of the things that they argued was it wasn't that cruel to sell children away from their mothers because slave women didn't love their children the way that white women loved their children. But what we see in this novel is that if there was no shortage of love, it just was slavery made love such a risk that was not innate. It wasn't inherent. It was created by the institution, which put their lives in the hands of someone else. So just like we were talking about, Baby Suggs realizes that she is that she has an identity, that these hands for the first time in her life are her hands. Something she had never been able to feel or experience in her life before that. Okay, so in this chapter, we discover that Sethe has cut the throat of the crawling already baby and has tried to kill the two boys unsuccessfully and is preparing to kill Denver when Stampede goes into the shed and rescues Denver. And this is there's no question about, this is a heartbreaking chapter, a heartbreaking section. But it is, like we said, it is based on a true story of Margaret Garner. So take a look at that newspaper article that I put in modules. Okay, so then we have, in chapter 17, we have Stampede trying to tell Paul D about it. And he shows him the newspaper article, and Paul D can't read. And so Paul D knows if there's a newspaper article about an African American, it's not going to be good. And he looks at the picture because he can't read the words, and he says, Stamp, that ain't her mouth. And over he says, that ain't her mouth. And Stamp reads him the article. For some reason, he wants him to know about this secret. And Paul D doesn't want to know it because it has to be horrible if it made it into the newspaper. One of the things about Margaret Garner that's interesting is Southerners used that case. It got a lot of press at the time. Southerners used that case to argue that pro-slavery argument that I was talking about, that slaves were innately animalistic. Abolitionists used it to make the case that slavery was so horrendous that it would drive a woman to kill her own children in order to save them. So there's two sides of it. Even at the time, the two sides of it were a part of the debate about slavery. So anyway, not a whole lot in that chapter, but Stampede tells Paul D the story, and Paul D doesn't want to hear it. We've had that theme running through it, came up in the discussion board. Denver goes deaf because she doesn't want to hear the answer. And there are many stories that Sethe doesn't want to tell. So sometimes the stories are too horrible to tell, and sometimes the stories are too horrible to hear. And it's interesting that even the way that Stampede introduces it to Paul D is not, he was there. It's not his own story. It's him reading the story from the paper, because it's too horrible even for Stampede to put into words. So he just reads the words. But for Paul D, it's too horrible to hear. So we have this, like, I don't know. And I think in some ways for us as readers, I mean, this is a tragic story. Sometimes for us, the story of slavery has been too terrible to hear and too terrible to tell. So we've just ignored it. And that's what Morrison is trying to undo, to make us know this story. to make us know the depth of the tragedy of this story. Because as Americans, as people who want to know history, we have to know it. We need to know this. Okay, I'm going to stop here and do one last video on Seth's chapter 18. But before this cuts me off,